When you've given 20 years of your life to protecting others, the last thing you expect is to die alone and forgotten. Officer Daniel Reyes thought his story was over as he lay bound beneath the railway bridge, his radio destroyed and hope slipping away with each passing hour. Then a golden retriever appeared through the morning mist, its gentle eyes filled with purpose. The dog worked quietly, chewing through the ropes that held Daniel captive, refusing to leave his side even when rescue seemed impossible. Hours later, when the search team finally found them, Daniel was alive, and the mysterious dog sat guard like a faithful protector. Nobody could explain where this dog came from, or why it knew exactly where to find a dying officer. What was the connection between this remarkable animal and Daniel's forgotten past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Daniel Reyes had worn the same badge for 20 years, and if you asked anyone in Cedar Falls, they'd tell you he was the finest officer their small town had ever known. The silver medal had lost its original shine long ago, dulled by countless shifts and weathered by the weight of responsibility that came with protecting a community of 8,000 souls nestled in the valley between rolling hills and endless farmland. Every morning at 6:30, Daniel would arrive at the station, before anyone else, brewing the first pot of coffee and reviewing the night reports with the same methodical attention he'd maintained since his rookie days. Sheriff Martinez often joked that Daniel ran tighter schedules than the railroad, but there was truth in the humor. Daniel needed structure, needed the predictability of routine to keep the darker thoughts at bay. "Morning, Danny," called Sarah Chen from the dispatch desk as she settled in with her usual thermos of green tea. At 55, Sarah had been the voice of Cedar Falls law enforcement for nearly as long as Daniel had been walking the beat. Her calm demeanor during emergencies had guided him through countless situations, from domestic disputes to the occasional cattle that wandered onto Highway 9. "Morning, Sarah." Daniel's voice carried the gravelly tone of a man who'd spent decades speaking into radios and addressing rowdy crowds at the county fair. "Anything interesting come in overnight?" Mrs. Henderson called about her cat again. Third time this week. Sarah's fingers danced across her keyboard with practiced efficiency. Tommy Rodriguez got into it with his neighbor over property lines, but they worked it out before we had to send anyone. "Oh, and there's a new family moved into the old Pemberton place. The Garcias might want to swing by and introduce yourself." Daniel nodded, making a mental note to stop by the Pemberton property during his afternoon rounds. In a town like Cedar Falls, community relationships weren't just part of the job. They were everything. People here expected their police to know their names, remember their children's birthdays, and show up at church potlucks without being asked. Sheriff Martinez emerged from his office, a mountain of a man whose presence filled any room he entered. At 62, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints reminded him daily of his advancing years. But his mind remained sharp as the day he'd first pinned on his badge 40 years ago. "Daniel, got a minute?" Martinez's tone suggested this wasn't a casual conversation. They stepped into Martinez's office, a cramped space made smaller by decades of accumulated reports, commendations, and photographs from community events. The sheriff closed the door and settled into his chair with a slight wince. "You've been putting in extra hours again." It wasn't a question. Martinez had learned to read Daniel's patterns better than anyone, recognizing the signs of a man trying to outrun his own thoughts through exhaustion. "Crime doesn't keep bankers' hours," Daniel replied, deflecting with the same response he'd used for months. "Neither does guilt, apparently." Martinez leaned back, his weathered hands folded across his chest. "When's the last time you took a real day off? And I don't mean those Sundays where you spend 6 hours organizing evidence files that don't need organizing." Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This conversation felt familiar, like a song played too many times on an old radio. "I'm fine, Sheriff." "Really? I've been watching you carry something heavy for years now, Danny. Whatever it is, maybe it's time to set it down." The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Martinez knew about the sleepless nights, the way Daniel's hands sometimes trembled when he thought no one was looking, the careful distance he maintained from anything that might remind him of his early mistakes. What the sheriff didn't know were the specifics, the details that ate at Daniel's conscience like acid on metal. "I appreciate the concern," Daniel finally said, standing to leave. "But I've got rounds to make." Martinez watched him go, recognizing the same stubborn pride that had kept good officers from seeking help for generations. He'd seen it destroy careers and families, watched it hollow out men who'd given everything to serve their communities, only to lose themselves in the process. Daniel's patrol route took him through the heart of Cedar Falls, past the grain elevator that dominated the skyline and the main street lined with businesses that had served the same families for generations. Kowalski's Hardware, where 3 generations of Kowalskis had helped farmers and homeowners tackle everything from leaky faucets to broken-down tractors. Miller's Diner, where the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, and Dolores Miller still remembered how everyone liked their eggs. At the elementary school, Daniel slowed his cruiser and waved to the crossing guard, Mrs. Patterson, who'd been shepherding children safely across Maple Street for 15 years. The sight of young faces pressed against classroom windows always stirred something uncomfortable in his chest, a reminder of responsibilities he'd failed to meet when it mattered most. The afternoon brought its usual collection of minor incidents. A fender bender in the Walmart parking lot, where Daniel mediated between 2 elderly drivers who'd known each other since childhood but suddenly couldn't agree on who'd been at fault. A noise complaint from the Johnson farm, where teenage cousins visiting from the city had decided to test the limits of their new sound system against the rural quiet. By evening, Daniel found himself driving the back roads that crisscrossed the farmland surrounding Cedar Falls. These were his favorite hours, when the setting sun painted the wheat fields gold, and the radio chatter died down to occasional check-ins with Sarah. Out here, surrounded by the vast openness of the prairie, a man could almost convince himself that the past was just another landscape he'd left behind. But even in these moments of relative peace, Daniel's hand would drift unconsciously to his shirt pocket, where he kept a small, folded piece of paper he never read, but couldn't bring himself to throw away. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its size, a constant reminder of the price of overconfidence and the devastating consequences of assumptions made too quickly. As darkness settled over the county, Daniel's radio crackled with Sarah's voice. "Unit 7, we've got a report of suspicious activity near the old railway bridge on County Road 15. Anonymous caller reported seeing lights and hearing voices in the area." Daniel's pulse quickened slightly. The abandoned railway bridge had been a magnet for teenagers and occasional vagrants for years, but something about an anonymous tip felt different, more serious. "Copy that. Dispatch. En route to County Road 15. The bridge lay 5 miles outside town, where the old Burlington Northern Line had once carried grain trains to markets in Kansas City and beyond. The tracks had been pulled up years ago, leaving only the concrete and steel structure spanning a shallow creek that meandered through cottonwood groves and pasture land. As Daniel's headlights swept across the gravel approach to the bridge, he felt the familiar weight of his duty settling across his shoulders like a well-worn coat. 20 years of service had taught him to trust his instincts, to approach every call with careful preparation and measured response. He had no way of knowing that this routine patrol would shatter everything he thought he understood about justice, redemption, and the mysterious ways that grace sometimes arrives in the form of 4 legs and a golden coat. Daniel parked his cruiser 50 yards from the bridge, following protocol that had become second nature over 2 decades of police work. The headlights illuminated the weathered concrete structure, but nothing seemed immediately out of place. No vehicles, no obvious signs of disturbance, just the usual accumulation of trash that seemed to migrate to abandoned places like iron filings to a magnet. He radioed his position to dispatch. Unit 7 on scene at County Road 15. Initial observation shows no visible activity. Beginning foot patrol of the area. Copy, Unit 7. Be advised, anonymous caller specifically mentioned the underside of the bridge structure. Daniel grimaced. The space beneath the bridge was a perfect hiding spot for anyone wanting to avoid detection. Teenagers drinking stolen beer, transients seeking shelter or worse. The creek running underneath provided enough ambient noise to mask conversations, and the concrete pillars created deep shadows that could conceal almost anything. Drawing his flashlight, Daniel approached the bridge with measured steps, his boots crunching softly on the gravel shoulder. 20 years of experience had taught him to read situations through subtle cues. The way shadows fell, the sound of wind through structures, the smell of recent human presence. Tonight, something felt wrong, though he couldn't articulate exactly. What triggered his unease? As he moved closer to the bridge, Daniel caught the faint scent of cigarette smoke, recent enough that the person who'd smoked it might still be nearby. His hand moved instinctively to his service weapon, not drawing it, but ensuring it was accessible if needed. "Hello, police officer. If anyone's down there, I need you to come out where I can see you." Silence answered him, broken only by the gentle murmur of water over stones and the distant lowing of cattle in a neighboring pasture. Daniel played his flashlight beam across the ground, looking for footprints or other signs of recent activity. The soft earth near the creek bank showed scuff marks that could have been made by boots, but the patterns were too disturbed to read clearly. He was examining what looked like a discarded beer bottle when the first blow landed across his shoulders, driving him to his knees. Daniel's flashlight flew from his grip, clattering against concrete and spinning away to cast wild patterns of light and shadow across the bridge supports. Training kicked in even as pain exploded through his back and neck. Daniel rolled left, reaching for his radio to call for backup, but rough hands grabbed his arms and yanked them behind his back. A knee pressed into his spine, while someone, more than one person he realized, worked to secure his wrists with what felt like zip ties. "Radio," one of his attackers said in a voice Daniel didn't recognize. "Get his radio." Daniel tried to speak, to identify himself as a police officer and demand they release him, but a cloth was shoved into his mouth and secured with tape that pulled tight against his cheeks. The taste of old grease and motor oil filled his mouth, making him gag. His portable radio was ripped from his belt and thrown against the concrete bridge support. The plastic housing cracked with a sharp sound that seemed to echo the breaking of his last connection to help. They'd taken his service weapon too, he realized, feeling the empty holster against his hip. "Blindfold him," came another voice. This, one carrying a slight accent Daniel couldn't place. "We don't want him seeing anything he shouldn't." A strip of cloth covered his eyes, plunging him into darkness that was somehow worse than the shadows under the bridge. Without sight, Daniel's other senses heightened, picking up details that might prove crucial if he survived this encounter. 2 men, possibly 3. One wore cologne that smelled expensive and out of place. Another breathed heavily, as if the physical exertion of the attack had winded him. They dragged Daniel to one of the bridge supports and secured him to the concrete pillar with rope that bit into his shoulders and chest. The position was uncomfortable, but not immediately life-threatening, which suggested this wasn't a random mugging. Random criminals would have taken his wallet and left him unconscious, not gone to the trouble of securing him so thoroughly. "This sends a message," the accented voice said. "Some things are better left alone." Daniel's mind raced, trying to understand what message they meant and what he might have done to warrant this treatment. His recent cases had been routine traffic violations, minor disputes, the occasional bar fight on Friday nights. Nothing that would justify kidnapping a police officer. "He'll be found eventually," the first voice replied. "Question is whether it'll be soon enough." Footsteps retreated, growing fainter until Daniel could no longer distinguish them from the ambient sounds of the countryside. He was alone, bound and helpless, with only the concrete pillar and his own rapidly darkening. Thoughts for company. The first hour was the hardest. Daniel tested the ropes systematically, looking for any give in the bindings, but his attackers had done their work well. The zip ties around his wrists were industrial strength, and the rope securing him to the pillar had been tied by someone who understood knots. Every movement only served to tighten the restraints or shift them into positions that cut off circulation to his hands. Pain from the initial blows settled into his shoulders and back, a constant ache that would worsen as the hours passed. The gag made breathing difficult, forcing him to draw air through his nose while fighting back waves of claustrophobia that threatened to send him into full panic. As the second hour dragged by, Daniel found himself thinking about the people who would miss him when he failed to check in. Sarah would notice first. She tracked every unit's location and status with the precision of an air traffic controller. Sheriff Martinez would organize a search, but how long would it take them to find this particular bridge? There were dozens of similar structures scattered across the county, and without knowing his exact location, they'd be searching blind. The irony wasn't lost on him that after 20 years of helping others in their darkest moments, he now found himself completely helpless, dependent on the same kind of rescue he'd provided countless times for others. The folded paper in his shirt pocket seemed to burn against his chest, a reminder of the one time he'd failed to provide that rescue when it mattered most. By the third hour, Daniel's thoughts had taken on the quality of a fever dream. The rope around his chest made deep breathing impossible, and his hands had gone numb from the zip ties. He found himself drifting between consciousness and something that wasn't quite sleep, his mind cycling through memories and regrets with the persistence of a broken record. Dawn was still hours away when he heard the first sound that didn't belong to the creek or the wind through the bridge structure. A soft padding, like footsteps, but different somehow. Too light for human feet, too rhythmic for the random movement of wild animals. Then, through the gap at the bottom of his blindfold, Daniel saw something that made him question his sanity. Golden fur caught the faint starlight, and warm breath touched his face as something large and gentle settled beside him. A dog, a golden retriever by the look of the coat and the size of the shadow it cast. The animal's presence was so unexpected, so perfectly timed, that Daniel wondered if he was hallucinating from oxygen deprivation or shock. The dog's behavior was unlike anything Daniel had ever witnessed. Instead of barking or running away, the animal seemed to assess the situation with almost human intelligence. It moved around Daniel carefully, as if taking inventory of the restraints and planning the most efficient approach to freeing him. When the dog began to chew through the rope, holding Daniel to the bridge support, he knew this was no ordinary stray. The animal worked with purpose and patience, its teeth finding the weakest points in the binding and applying just enough pressure to fray the fibers without injuring Daniel in the process. As the rope finally gave way and Daniel slumped forward, no longer held upright by the restraints, the golden retriever moved to his hands, working on the zip ties with the same methodical determination. The plastic was tougher than rope, requiring more time and effort, but the dog never wavered in its task. Throughout the rescue, the animal never made a sound beyond the soft working of its teeth and the gentle rhythm of its breathing. It stayed, close enough that Daniel could feel its warmth, a living presence that pushed back against the despair and isolation that had threatened to overwhelm him. When Daniel's hands were finally free and he pulled away the blindfold and gag, the golden retriever sat back on its haunches and regarded him with eyes that seemed far older and wiser than any dog should be. In the pre-dawn light, Daniel could see that this was a mature animal, its muzzle showing the gray of advancing years and its coat bearing the scars of a life lived outdoors. "Where did you come from?" Daniel whispered, his voice hoarse from hours. of silence. The dog offered no answer beyond a gentle wag of its tail and a soft whine that might have been sympathy or satisfaction at a job well done. As sirens wailed in the distance, Sarah had finally raised the alarm about his missed check-ins. The mysterious golden retriever settled beside Daniel like a guardian, refusing to leave his side even when the rescue vehicles arrived with their flashing lights and urgent voices. Daniel knew he would spend the rest of his life wondering how this remarkable animal had found him in his darkest hour, and why it had cared enough to save a man who couldn't even save himself. The emergency medical technicians found Daniel and the golden retriever just as the sun crested the horizon, painting the countryside in shades of amber and gold that seemed to echo the dog's coat. Paramedic Janet Morrison had seen her share of trauma victims during 15 years of service, but she'd never encountered a scene quite like this. A bound police officer freed by what appeared to be a stray dog that refused to leave his side. "Sir, I'm Janet with Cedar Falls EMS. Can you tell me your name and what happened here?" Daniel's voice came out as a croak, his throat raw from the gag and hours of restricted breathing. "Officer Daniel Reyes, badge number 447. I was ambushed, 3 men, maybe more. They bound me to the bridge support and left me here." As Janet checked his vital signs and examined the rope burns on his wrists and chest, the golden retriever maintained a protective position beside Daniel, alert but not aggressive. Every time one of the EMTs moved too quickly or spoke too loudly, the dog would shift slightly, positioning itself between Daniel and any perceived threat. "What about the dog?" Janet asked, noting how the animal's presence seemed to calm her. "Patient. Is it yours?" "I've never seen it before tonight," Daniel replied, reaching out to touch the dog's head. The contact seemed to ground him, providing an anchor point in the surreal aftermath of his ordeal. "It saved my life. Chewed through the ropes and freed me." Sheriff Martinez arrived as they were loading Daniel into the ambulance, his face grim with the controlled anger of a man who'd just learned that one of his officers had been targeted for reasons he didn't understand. The sight of Daniel's torn uniform and the evidence of his restraints painted a picture that made Martinez's jaw clench with barely contained fury. "Danny, who did this to you?" Martinez's voice carried the weight of both personal concern and professional responsibility. "I couldn't see them. They blindfolded me immediately." Daniel winced as the EMTs lifted him onto the stretcher. 3 voices, maybe more. One had an accent I couldn't place. They mentioned something about sending a message, about leaving things alone. "What things? What case might have triggered this?" Daniel shook his head, genuinely puzzled. "I've been going through routine calls for weeks, nothing that would warrant this kind of response." As the ambulance prepared to depart for Cedar Falls General Hospital, the golden retriever made its intentions clear. When Janet tried to close the ambulance doors, the dog stepped forward and placed its front paws on the bumper, looking directly at Daniel with an expression that seemed to ask permission to accompany him. "I don't think we can take the dog to the hospital," Janet said apologetically. "Then I'm not going," Daniel replied, surprising himself with the firmness of his response. Something about the animal's presence felt essential, as if the golden retriever represented more than just a random rescue. "This dog saved my life. I'm not abandoning it now." Sheriff Martinez intervened with the practical wisdom that had served him well for 4 decades. "I'll follow in my vehicle with the dog. We'll figure out what to do from there." The ride to the hospital gave Daniel time to process what had happened, though his mind kept circling back to the same impossible question. How had a stray dog found him in the middle of nowhere, and why had it possessed the intelligence and determination to free him? The animal's behavior suggested training and purpose that went far beyond typical canine instincts. At the hospital, Dr. Patricia Hernandez conducted a thorough examination that revealed bruising consistent with Daniel's account of being struck and bound, but no serious injuries. The rope burns would heal, and there was no sign of permanent damage from his ordeal. "You're incredibly fortunate," Dr. Hernandez observed while cleaning the abrasions on Daniel's wrists. A few more hours in those restraints could have caused severe circulation problems, especially given the temperature drop overnight. Sheriff Martinez had stationed himself in the hallway outside Daniel's room, where the golden retriever lay, with its head on its paws, maintaining a patient vigil that impressed the nursing staff. Every few minutes, someone would stop to offer the dog water or ask about its remarkable behavior during the rescue. Dr. Lisa Warren, Cedar Falls' only veterinarian, arrived at Martinez's request to examine the mysterious animal. A woman in her mid-40s with gentle hands and an intuitive understanding of animal behavior, Dr. Warren had built her practice on the trust of farmers and pet owners who appreciated her no-nonsense approach to veterinary care. "Well, he's definitely a golden retriever," Dr. Warren announced after a thorough examination in the hospital parking lot. "Male, approximately 7 to 8 years old, in good health despite showing signs of living outdoors for an extended period. No collar, no microchip, no obvious identifying markers. Any idea where he might have come from?" Martinez asked. "That's the puzzling part. This dog has clearly been someone's companion. He's well socialized, responds to basic commands, and shows signs of advanced training. Golden retrievers don't develop these kinds of problem-solving skills and protective instincts without significant human interaction." Dr. Warren paused, stroking the dog's head as she considered the implications. "The condition of his coat and the calluses on his pads suggest he's been living rough for months, maybe longer. But his behavior around Officer Reyes indicates a deep understanding of human distress and a willingness to act on that understanding." Daniel, discharged from the hospital with instructions to rest and follow up with his physician, found himself facing a decision he hadn't anticipated. The golden retriever had made it clear that it intended to stay with him, following him from the hospital entrance to his truck with the quiet determination of a shadow. "I can't just take someone's dog," Daniel said to Martinez as they stood in the hospital parking lot. "You're not taking it," Martinez replied. "From what I can see, it's adopted you. Question is whether you're willing to accept the adoption." The drive to Daniel's small house on the outskirts of Cedar Falls passed in contemplative silence, the golden retriever sitting in the passenger seat as if it had been making this journey for years. Daniel lived alone in a modest 2-bedroom home he'd inherited from his parents, a quiet place surrounded by mature oak trees and a yard that had seen better days. Inside, the dog explored the house with polite curiosity, investigating each room before returning to Daniel's side as he settled into his recliner with a cup of coffee and the weight of questions that had no obvious answers. "What am I supposed to call you?" Daniel asked the animal, which had positioned itself on the floor beside his chair. The dog looked up at him with intelligent brown eyes that seemed to suggest the name didn't matter as much as the connection they'd forged in those dark hours under the bridge. "Guardian," Daniel said finally. "That's what you were for me, Guardian." The newly christened Guardian's tail thumped once against the floor, as if approving of the choice. As evening settled over Cedar Falls, Daniel found himself fielding phone calls from concerned colleagues, curious neighbors, and local reporters who'd caught wind of the story. Each conversation required him to relive the details of his ordeal, but also to acknowledge the inexplicable role that Guardian had played in his survival. "The thing is," he told Sarah Chen during one of the calls, "this dog didn't just happen to wander by. It was like it was looking for me specifically, like it knew I needed help." "Dogs have better instincts than people give them credit for," Sarah replied. "Maybe it heard you struggling or picked up on some scent we don't understand." But even as Daniel nodded in agreement, he knew that Sarah's rational explanation didn't fully account for what he'd witnessed. Guardian's behavior had been purposeful in a way that went beyond instinct or training. The dog had assessed the situation, developed a plan, and executed that plan with the kind of intelligence that suggested deeper understanding. As night fell, and Daniel prepared for what he hoped would be his first peaceful sleep in years, Guardian settled on the floor beside his bed, maintaining the same protective watch he'd begun under the bridge. The dog's presence brought comfort that Daniel hadn't realized he'd been missing, a sense of companionship that pushed back against the isolation he'd carried for too long. Tomorrow would bring new questions and the beginning of an investigation into who had attacked him and why. But tonight, with Guardian's gentle breathing providing a counterpoint to the night sounds outside his window, Daniel allowed himself to believe that perhaps some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, and some gifts were meant to be accepted without question. Daniel woke to the sound of Guardian's gentle whining, a soft vocalization that seemed designed to rouse him without startling. The dog stood by the bedroom window, alert but not agitated, watching something in the yard that Daniel couldn't immediately identify. Pale morning light filtered through curtains that hadn't been opened in months, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt as though he'd actually slept instead of merely enduring the hours between sunset and dawn. The events of the previous night returned in fragments, the attack, the hours of helplessness, and the miraculous appearance of the golden retriever who now served as his self-appointed guardian. Daniel's body ached from the restraints and the concrete floor, but the pain felt manageable, overshadowed by a growing sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. Guardian's attention remained fixed on the window, his tail wagging slowly as he tracked movement outside. Daniel joined him and saw Sheriff Martinez's patrol car pulling into the driveway, followed by a van marked with the logo of the county crime scene unit. "Looks like the investigation is starting early," Daniel said to Guardian, who acknowledged the comment with a brief glance before returning his attention to the approaching vehicles. Martinez climbed out of his car with the careful movements of a man whose joints reminded him daily of his advancing years, while crime scene technician Ray Kowalski emerged from the van carrying a camera and evidence kit. Ray was the nephew of the hardware store owner, a detail-oriented man in his 30s who'd turned his passion for photography into a career documenting criminal investigations. "Morning, Danny," Martinez called as Daniel opened the front door. "Hope you don't mind us starting early, but I want to process that bridge scene while any evidence is still intact." "Of course, let me get dressed and I'll come with you. Actually, I'd prefer if you stayed here and rested. Ray and I can handle the scene documentation. What I really need from you is to start thinking about who might want to send you a message." Guardian padded outside and approached the two men with cautious curiosity, allowing Martinez to pet his head while maintaining a respectful distance from Ray's equipment. The dog's behavior suggested familiarity with law enforcement procedures, another a piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit with the story of a simple stray. "Any luck tracking down the dog's owner?" Daniel asked. "I've got Sarah calling every veterinary clinic and animal shelter within a 50-mile radius," Martinez replied. "So far, no one's reported a missing golden retriever matching this guy's description." Ray crouched down to examine Guardian more closely, his photographer's eye picking up details that others might miss. "He's definitely been living rough for a while," Ray observed, pointing to scarring on the dog's muzzle and legs. "These marks looked like they came from brambles and rough terrain, not from another animal or abuse." "Dr. Warren estimated he's been on his own for several months," Daniel said, "but his behavior suggests extensive training and socialization. Maybe he belonged to someone who died or moved away," Martinez suggested. "Wouldn't be the first time a pet got left behind during difficult circumstances." As the two officers prepared to leave for the bridge, Daniel found himself reluctant to let Guardian out of his sight. The attachment felt irrational. He'd known the dog for less than 24 hours, but the bond forged during those dark hours under the bridge seemed to have created a connection that defied logical explanation. "Stay here with Daniel," Martinez said to Guardian, as if the dog could understand complex instructions. "Keep him safe while we're gone." Guardian's response was to return to Daniel's side and sit with the alertness of a sentry, watching until the patrol car and van disappeared down the rural road. The morning passed quietly, with Daniel fielding phone calls from colleagues, and attempting to piece together any connection between his recent cases and the attack. He reviewed his notes from the past month, looking for patterns or complaints that might have escalated beyond normal police work, but found nothing that rose to the level of justifying kidnapping and assault. Guardian seemed content to lie on the living room floor, occasionally lifting his head when cars passed on the distant highway or when birds landed in the oak trees outside. The dog's presence provided a calming influence that Daniel hadn't realized he needed, a constant reminder that he wasn't alone in dealing with the aftermath of his ordeal. Around noon, Dr. Warren arrived unannounced, carrying a small leather bag and wearing the concerned expression of someone who'd been thinking about a problem all night. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," she said, as Daniel invited her inside. "I couldn't stop thinking about your guardian here, and I wanted to take another look at him." Guardian approached Dr. Warren with the same cautious friendliness he'd shown the previous day, allowing her to examine him while keeping Daniel in sight. The veterinarian's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking teeth, eyes, and ears, with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned to read stories in the physical condition of animals. "There's something I missed yesterday," Dr. Warren said, running her fingers along Guardian's neck. "He's wearing a collar, but it's so weathered and tight against his fur that it's almost invisible." Daniel knelt beside the dog as Dr. Warren carefully worked to expose what appeared to be a thin leather collar, darkened by age and weather, to the point where it blended seamlessly with Guardian's golden coat. The leather was cracked and worn, smooth by years of wear, suggesting it had been in place for a very long time. "Can you remove it safely?" Daniel asked. "I think so, but I'll need to cut it. The leather has shrunk and hardened over time." Dr. Warren opened her bag and withdrew a small pair of scissors designed for veterinary use. "This might be our only clue to his identity." Guardian remained perfectly still as Dr. Warren worked, as if understanding the importance of the procedure. The leather parted with a soft sound, and the collar fell away to reveal fur that was lighter underneath, protected from sun and weather by the constant covering. Dr. Warren examined the collar carefully, turning it over in her hands and holding it up to the light from the window. "There's no nameplate or tag, but there's something here." She pointed to a small area where the leather had been folded over and sewn to create a pocket or pouch. "Can you open it?" Daniel asked, leaning closer. With careful fingers, Dr. Warren worked at the aged stitching until it gave way, revealing a small space that had been protected from the elements by the fold in the leather. Inside was a piece of paper, folded multiple times and yellowed with age, but still intact. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper, revealing what appeared to be a child's drawing rendered in colored pencil on construction paper. The image showed a young girl with long, dark hair standing beside a golden retriever in what looked like a park or playground setting. The artistic style was unmistakably that of a child, but the attention to detail and emotional content suggested talent beyond the artist's years. At the bottom of the drawing, in careful block letters, were the words "Emma and Max forever." The name hit Daniel like a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs and sending him stumbling backward into his recliner. Emma. The case that had haunted him for 15 years, the investigation that had ended his confidence as a police officer and begun his long journey into guilt and self-doubt. "Daniel, what is it?" Dr. Warren asked, alarmed by his sudden pallor. "Emma Martinez," Daniel whispered, staring at the drawing as memories flooded back with devastating clarity. "She was 8 years old when she disappeared. I was the investigating officer." Guardian moved to Daniel's side, pressing against his leg with the same protective instinct he'd shown under the bridge. The dog seemed to sense the emotional weight of the discovery, offering comfort in the form of physical presence and unwavering loyalty. "This dog, Max, he belonged to Emma," Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength as the implications became clear. "Somehow, after all these years, he found me. The girl's dog found the officer who failed to save her." Dr. Warren sat back, on her heels, the collar still in her hands, as she tried to process the extraordinary coincidence, or perhaps something more than coincidence, that had brought Guardian into Daniel's life at his moment of greatest need. "How long ago did Emma disappear?" she asked gently. 15 years this fall. Her body was never found." Daniel's voice carried the weight of every sleepless night and self-recrimination that had followed the failed investigation. "I was young, overconfident. I made assumptions that cost precious time in the search." Guardian's brown eyes regarded Daniel with what seemed like understanding, as if the dog recognized the pain in his voice and accepted it without judgment. The animal that had saved his life was connected to the case that had nearly destroyed it, a circle of guilt and redemption that defied rational explanation. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the living room floor, Daniel found himself studying the child's drawing with new eyes, seeing not just the artwork of a missing girl, but a message from the past that had waited 15 years to be delivered. The realization that Guardian was Emma's dog, Max, changed everything about Daniel's understanding of his rescue. This wasn't random chance or divine intervention. It was the fulfillment of a promise made by a dying child to her most faithful companion. Guardian had spent 15 years in the wilderness, surviving against impossible odds while carrying the memory of Emma's final days and the burden of secrets that could bring her killer to justice. Dr. Warren returned to her examination of the weathered collar, noting details that had been obscured by years of wear and exposure. "This leather is hand-tooled," she observed, running her fingers along the faded surface. "Expensive work, probably custom-made, the kind of collar someone would commission for a beloved pet." Daniel remembered the missing person reports from Emma's case, the desperate searches that had consumed the community for weeks after her disappearance. There had been mentions of her dog going missing at the same time, a detail that had been overshadowed by the more urgent search for the child herself. Everyone had assumed that Max had simply run away in confusion or been taken by the same person who had abducted Emma. The truth was far more remarkable. Guardian had been with Emma during her captivity, had helped her escape, and had stayed with her during those final weeks in the wilderness when exposure and exhaustion slowly claimed her young life. The scars on his muzzle and legs told the story of a dog who had fought to protect his companion, and then spent years living rough while guarding her memory. "How did he survive out there for so long?" Daniel asked, marveling at the resilience and determination that had kept Guardian alive through 15 winters. "Golden retrievers are intelligent and adaptable," Dr. Warren replied. "In rural areas like this, a dog can survive by hunting small game, scavenging from farms, and finding shelter in abandoned buildings or natural caves. But survival alone doesn't explain his behavior. The way he found you, the way he freed you, that suggests purpose beyond basic instinct." Guardian seemed to understand that they were discussing his past. The dog moved closer to Daniel, pressing against his leg, with the same protective instinct he'd shown under the bridge. His brown eyes held depths of experience that spoke of hardships endured and loyalty tested, but never broken. Daniel's phone rang, interrupting his contemplation of the extraordinary circumstances that had brought Guardian into his life. "Sheriff." Martinez's voice carried the controlled excitement of a man who had just received important information. "Danny, we've got a break in your case. The state lab ran the DNA from that cigarette butt, and we got a hit in the system." "Who is it?" "Thomas Kellerman, real estate developer, serves on the city council, owns half the commercial property in Cedar Falls." Martinez paused, and Daniel could hear papers rustling in the background. "He's got a clean record locally, but the feds have been watching him for suspected ties to human trafficking operations." The name hit Daniel like a physical blow. Thomas Kellerman was one of Cedar Falls' most respected citizens, a man whose charitable contributions and civic involvement had made him virtually above suspicion. The idea that he could be connected to Emma's disappearance and to Daniel's recent attack seemed impossible. "Are you sure about the DNA match?" positive identification. The lab ran it twice to be certain. Martinez's voice hardened with the anger of a man who'd discovered betrayal within his own community. Kellerman's been playing the role of concerned citizen for years while operating right under our noses. Guardian's reaction to the name was immediate and unmistakable. At the mention of Kellerman, the dog's ears flattened against his head, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. His body language shifted from relaxed companionship to alert tension, as if the very sound of that name triggered memories of trauma and danger. "Guardian knows that name," Daniel said into the phone, watching as the dog moved to the window and began scanning the yard with the intensity of a sentry. "He's reacting like he recognizes Kellerman as a threat." That makes sense. If Kellerman was involved in Emma's abduction, Max, Guardian, would have seen him, probably tried to protect her. Martinez's voice carried the satisfaction of pieces finally clicking into place. "We need to move carefully here. Kellerman has resources and connections that could make him dangerous if he realizes we're closing in." As they discussed strategy for approaching Kellerman, Daniel found himself studying Guardian's behavior with new understanding. The dog's protective instincts weren't just general loyalty. They were specific responses to a threat that Guardian had faced before. Emma's dog had survived an encounter with a predator and had spent 15 years preparing for the possibility of facing that predator again. The evening brought a sense of purpose that Daniel hadn't felt in years. Guardian had led him not just to safety, but to the truth about Emma's disappearance and the identity of her killer. The connection between past and present was no longer a mystery. It was a mission that both man and dog were finally ready to complete. Dr. Warren packed her equipment and prepared to leave, but paused at the door to offer one final observation. "Guardian saved your life for a reason, Daniel. He's been waiting 15 years for someone he could trust to help him finish what Emma started." As night settled over Cedar Falls, Daniel sat in his living room with Guardian beside him, studying Emma's drawing and planning their next steps. The child's artwork wasn't just a memento, it was evidence in a case that had never been properly solved. Emma had preserved her story in the only way she could, trusting that someday her faithful companion would find someone brave enough to seek justice for her death. Guardian's presence had transformed Daniel from a guilt-ridden officer, contemplating retirement, into a man with renewed purpose and determination. The dog who had saved his life was asking him to complete the most important case of his career, and Daniel was finally ready to honor that request. The past had found them both, and tomorrow they would begin the work of bringing Emma Martinez's killer to justice. Guardian had protected her memory for 15 years, and now it was time for that protection to extend to other children who might fall prey to the same predator. As Daniel prepared for bed, Guardian took up his familiar position, on the floor beside the bed, maintaining the same vigilant watch he'd kept since their first night together. But tonight there was a different quality to the dog's alertness. Not the restless energy of an animal with an unfinished mission, but the focused determination of a partner preparing for the most important work of his life. Emma Martinez would finally receive the justice she deserved, and Thomas Kellerman would learn that some crimes could never be buried deeply enough to escape the memory of a faithful dog and the dedication of an officer who understood that redemption came through service to others. The discovery of Emma's drawing changed everything. Daniel sat in his living room holding the faded piece of construction paper while Guardian, Max, watched him with eyes that seemed to carry the weight of 15 years of secrets. Dr. Warren had left an hour ago, promising to keep the discovery confidential until Daniel decided how to proceed, but the veterinarian's parting words echoed in his mind. Sometimes the past finds a way to complete unfinished business. Daniel's hands shook as he studied the child's artwork. Emma had captured something in her drawing that went beyond simple representation. The bond between a girl and her dog was rendered with the kind of emotional honesty that only children possessed. The golden retriever in the picture wore what appeared to be the same leather collar that had just been removed from Guardian's neck, and the girl's expression conveyed pure joy and unconditional love. The memory of Emma Martinez's disappearance returned with devastating clarity. October 15th, 15 years ago, a date burned into Daniel's consciousness like a brand. He'd been 27 then, barely 5 years on the force, but already developing a reputation for thoroughness and dedication. When the call came in about a missing 8-year-old, Daniel had responded with the confidence of a young officer who believed that determination and proper procedure could solve any case. Emma had been playing in Riverside Park while her mother, Sofia Martinez, chatted with friends on a nearby bench. The park was considered safe, a small fenced area with playground equipment, walking paths, and clear sight lines that should have made it impossible for a child to simply vanish. But when Sofia looked up from her conversation, Emma was gone. Daniel had arrived within minutes of the initial call, taking charge of the scene with an assurance that now seemed like arrogance. He'd organized a systematic search of the park and surrounding area, interviewed the other parents and children present, and established a timeline of Emma's disappearance. Everything had been done by the book, following protocols designed to maximize the chances of a quick recovery. But Daniel had made one crucial assumption that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He'd believed that Emma had wandered off on her own. 8-year-olds were known for their curiosity and poor judgment about safety. The park bordered a wooded area that led to farmland and eventually to the creek that meandered through the county. Daniel had focused the initial search on those natural areas, convinced that Emma had simply gotten lost while exploring. The assumption had cost them precious hours. While search teams combed the woods and creek banks, calling Emma's name and looking for signs of a lost child, the real truth was already unfolding elsewhere. By the time Daniel realized that Emma hadn't wandered off but had been taken, the trail had gone cold, and the critical first hours of an abduction investigation had been wasted. Guardian rose from his position on the floor and padded over to Daniel, resting his massive head on the armrest of the recliner. The gesture was gentle but insistent, as if the dog recognized the dark path Daniel's thoughts were taking and wanted to provide an anchor to the present. "You were there, weren't you?" Daniel said softly, stroking the graying fur around Guardian's ears. "You saw what happened to her." The dog's eyes held depths that seemed almost human, and Daniel found himself wondering what memories lay behind that intelligent gaze. Had Guardian Max witnessed Emma's abduction? Had he tried to protect her, only to be separated in the confusion? The scars on his muzzle and legs suddenly took on new significance, possibly evidence of a fight to defend his young companion. Daniel's phone rang, interrupting his dark reverie. Sheriff Martinez's voice carried the grim satisfaction of a man who'd uncovered important evidence. "Danny, we need to talk. Ray found something at the bridge that changes everything." "What kind of something?" "The kind that suggests your attack wasn't random. Can you come to the station and bring the dog? I have a feeling he might be relevant to what we've discovered." The Cedar Falls police station occupied a modest brick building on Main Street, its institutional architecture softened by flower beds that Sarah Chen maintained with the same attention to detail she brought to her dispatch duties. Daniel had walked through these doors thousands of times over the past 20 years, but today felt different, as if he were returning to a place that held secrets he was only now ready to confront. Guardian followed Daniel through the station, with the calm assurance of an animal accustomed to official buildings and formal procedures. Several officers stopped to greet them, word of the rescue having spread through the small department like ripples in a pond. Sheriff Martinez was waiting in the conference room, surrounded by photographs and evidence bags that told the story of Daniel's ordeal in clinical detail. Crime scene photos showed the bridge from multiple angles, the concrete pillar where Daniel had been bound, and close-ups of the rope and zip ties that had held him captive. "Ray did excellent work," Martinez began, gesturing to the array of evidence. But it was what he found in the surrounding area that really caught our attention. Martinez picked up a clear plastic evidence bag containing what appeared to be a cigarette butt, Newport menthol, smoked down to the filter. Ray found it about 20 yards from where you were held, fresh enough that it was probably dropped the night of your attack. Daniel studied the evidence, noting the careful documentation and chain of custody procedures that would make it admissible. In court, DNA analysis, already sent to the state lab, but that'll take weeks. What's more interesting is where Ray found it. Martinez pulled out an aerial photograph of the bridge area, marked with colored pins, showing the locations of various pieces of evidence. The cigarette was found near a vantage point that would have allowed someone to watch the entire area, while staying hidden. A lookout? That's what we think. Someone was positioned to watch for approaching vehicles or to signal if the situation changed. Martinez's expression darkened. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment attack, Danny. Someone planned this carefully. Guardian had positioned himself beside Daniel's chair, alert but relaxed, as if accustomed to participating in law enforcement briefings. The dog's presence seemed to focus Daniel's thoughts, providing emotional stability that allowed him to process the implications of Martinez's findings. "There's something else," Martinez continued, pulling out another evidence bag. This one contained what appeared to be a piece of fabric, dark blue or black, torn and stained with what might have been blood. Ray found this caught on a piece of rebar under the bridge. Looks like it came from someone's jacket or shirt. Daniel examined the fabric through the clear plastic, noting the weight and texture that suggested quality clothing rather than workwear or casual attire. Expensive? Dr. Kim at the hospital took a look. She has a background in textiles from before she went into medicine. She thinks it's wool blend, probably from a suit jacket or dress coat. Not the kind of thing you'd expect someone to wear for manual labor or criminal activity. The implication was clear. Daniel's attackers had been well-dressed, organized, and familiar enough with police procedures to plan their assault carefully. This wasn't random violence or opportunistic crime. It was a targeted attack with professional elements that suggested larger forces at work. As they discussed the evidence, Guardian's behavior began to change subtly. The dog's ears pricked forward, and his body language shifted from relaxed attention to alert focus. He moved to the conference room window and stood with his nose nearly touching the glass, a low whine building in his throat. "What's he looking at?" Martinez asked, joining Guardian at the window. Outside, the afternoon traffic on Main Street proceeded with its usual small-town rhythm. The hardware store across the street showed no unusual activity, and the handful of pedestrians seemed engaged in routine errands. But Guardian's attention was fixed on something specific, his entire body tense with recognition or concern. Daniel approached the window and followed Guardian's gaze, scanning the street for whatever had triggered the dog's reaction. At first, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. Farmers in pickup trucks, mothers with children heading to the elementary school, elderly residents making their way to Miller's diner for early dinner. Then he saw him, a man in a dark suit standing beside a black sedan parked in front of the bank. The man appeared to be talking on a cell phone, but his attention seemed focused on the police station rather than his conversation. Even from a distance, there was something familiar about his posture and the way he held himself. "Martinez," Daniel said quietly, "do you recognize the man in the suit?" Sheriff Martinez squinted through the window, his hand moving instinctively toward his service weapon. "Can't say that I do, but Guardian sure seems to know him." As they watched, the man ended his phone call and climbed into the sedan. The vehicle pulled away from the curb and disappeared around the corner, but Guardian continued to stare out the window for several minutes afterward, his hackles slightly raised and his breathing quick and shallow. "That wasn't coincidence," Daniel said with growing certainty. "Whoever that was, Guardian recognized him. And I don't think it was a friendly recognition." Martinez was already reaching for his radio, calling for patrol units to canvass the area and locate the black sedan. But Daniel suspected they wouldn't find it. The timing of the man's departure suggested surveillance that had been interrupted by discovery. As afternoon turned to evening and the investigation continued, Daniel found himself studying Emma's, drawing again, searching for clues that might connect her 15-year-old disappearance to his recent attack. The coincidence of Guardian's appearance in his life seemed too perfect to be random, suggesting connections and purposes that existed beyond the realm of normal police work. The golden retriever who had saved his life was the same dog that had belonged to the missing girl whose case had destroyed his confidence as an officer. Now, 15 years later, someone had attacked him with professional precision and left him to die in a location where only Guardian could find him. The past was not finished with Daniel Reyes, and he was beginning to understand that his redemption and, perhaps Emma's justice, lay in following wherever Guardian chose to lead him. That evening, Daniel sat in Sheriff Martinez's office with Emma's missing person file spread across the desk between them, like evidence of a crime that refused to stay buried. The manila folder had grown thick over the years, filled with witness statements, search reports, and follow-up investigations that had all led to the same dead end. Emma Martinez had simply vanished from Riverside Park on October 15th, 15 years ago, leaving behind only questions and the kind of grief that never fully healed. Guardian lay on the floor beside Daniel's chair, his chin resting on his paws, but his eyes alert and watchful. The dog's presence had become a constant comfort, but it also served as a living reminder of the connection between past and present that Daniel was only beginning to understand. "I should have told you about this years ago," Martinez said, his voice heavy with the weight of secrets kept too long. "But I didn't see the point in adding to your guilt when it wouldn't bring Emma back." Daniel looked up from the crime scene photographs he'd been studying, images of Riverside Park taken on the day of Emma's disappearance, showing the playground equipment, the walking paths, and the wooded area where the initial search had focused. "Told me what?" Martinez opened a drawer in his desk and withdrew a folder that Daniel had never seen before, one that bore the notation, "Confidential Internal Affairs Investigation," in Martinez's careful handwriting. The sheriff's hands showed their age as he placed the folder on the desk, his fingers trembling slightly with emotion rather than infirmity. 3 months after Emma disappeared, I conducted my own review of the investigation. Martinez began, "Not because I thought you'd done anything wrong, but because I needed to understand how a child could vanish without a trace in a town where everyone knows everyone else's business." Daniel's throat constricted as he realized what Martinez was about to reveal. "You found something. I found that you followed procedure exactly as you'd been trained. Your initial response was textbook: secure the scene, organize the search, establish a timeline. Any experienced officer would have made the same assumptions you did." Martinez opened the Internal Affairs folder, revealing documents that Daniel recognized as copies of his own reports and witness statements. "The mistake wasn't yours, Danny. It was mine." The confession hung in the air between them like smoke from an extinguished candle, visible and affecting but impossible to grasp or change. Daniel felt his worldview shifting. The foundational guilt that had shaped 15 years of his life suddenly called into question by the man whose opinion mattered more than any other. "I received a phone call that afternoon," Martinez continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "About 2 hours after Emma's disappearance was reported, a man claimed to have information about what happened to her, said he'd seen suspicious activity near the park, but was afraid to come forward publicly." Daniel leaned forward, his heart pounding as pieces of a puzzle he'd never known existed began to fall into place. "What kind of information?" "He claimed to have seen a man in a suit talking to Emma near the playground equipment. Said it looked like the man was showing her something, photographs or documents. When I asked for details, he described the man as well-dressed, driving an expensive car, someone who didn't belong in a neighborhood park on a weekday afternoon." The description matched the mysterious figure Guardian had reacted to outside the police station, a connection that sent chills down Daniel's spine. "Did you investigate the tip?" Martinez's expression was that of a man who'd carried regret for too long. "I tried to, but when I asked the caller to come in and give a formal statement, he panicked, said he'd made a mistake, that he hadn't seen anything after all." The line went dead, and we never heard from him again. Guardian lifted his head from his paws, as if sensing the emotional weight of the conversation. The dog's brown eyes moved between Daniel and Martinez with an intelligence that seemed to recognize the importance of what was being revealed. "Why? Didn't you tell me?" Daniel asked, though part of him already understood the answer. "Because by then, you'd already started blaming yourself for the delayed search. You were convinced that your assumptions had cost Emma her life, and you were punishing yourself in ways that worried everyone who cared about you." Martinez closed the internal affairs folder with careful precision. "I thought that adding the uncertainty of an anonymous tip would only make things worse." Daniel stared at the closed folder, understanding now that his guilt had been based on incomplete information, that the failure he'd carried for 15 years might not have been a failure at all. The realization should have brought relief, but instead, it brought a different kind of pain. The awareness of how much suffering could have been avoided if the truth had been shared sooner. "There's more," Martinez said, opening Emma's missing person file to a section Daniel had never been allowed to see. "The anonymous caller made 2 more attempts to contact us over the following weeks. Both times, he claimed to have additional information about Emma's disappearance, but both times he hung up before providing any details." "Did you record the calls?" "The third one? Yes. The quality isn't great, but you can hear the fear in his voice." Martinez reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a small digital recorder, the kind used for documenting witness interviews. "I've listened to this recording probably 100 times over the years, trying to identify the caller or understand what made him so afraid." The recording was brief and filled with static, but the caller's voice came through clearly enough to make out his words. "I saw what happened to the little girl. The man in the suit, he didn't just talk to her, he took her, but I can't. They'll kill me if they know I saw." The line went dead with an audible click. Daniel felt Guardian's head rest against his leg, a gesture of comfort that seemed to acknowledge the emotional weight of what they were hearing. The dog's presence provided an anchor point in the swirling uncertainty of revelations that changed everything he thought he knew about Emma's case. "The voice," Daniel said, rewinding the recording and playing it again. "Do you recognize it?" "I've wondered about that for 15 years. There's something familiar about the accent, the way he pronounces certain words, but I've never been able to place it." Martinez leaned back in his chair, his expression that of a man who'd carried secrets for too long. "What I can tell you is that whoever made that call was genuinely terrified." As they listened to the recording a third time, Guardian's behavior began to change. The dog's ears pricked forward, and a low whine built in his throat. Not distress, but recognition. His body language suggested that he was responding to something in the recording that the humans couldn't perceive. "Guardian recognizes the voice," Daniel said with growing certainty, "or at least he's reacting to something about it." Martinez studied the dog with new interest. If Max Guardian belonged to Emma, he might have been present when she was taken. He could have seen the abductor, heard his voice. The implications were staggering. Guardian wasn't just a dog who had miraculously saved Daniel's life. He was potentially the only witness to Emma Martinez's abduction, an animal who had carried the memory of that traumatic event for 15 years while surviving on his own. "In the wilderness. That's why someone attacked you," Martinez said, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. "They found out that Guardian had surfaced, that he'd bonded with the officer who investigated Emma's disappearance. They were trying to eliminate both of you before the connection could be made." Daniel felt the weight of 15 years of guilt beginning to lift, replaced by a different kind of responsibility. the obligation to seek justice for Emma and to protect the remarkable animal who had become both his savior and his partner in uncovering the truth. As the evening deepened and the police station grew quiet around them, Daniel made a decision that would define the rest of his career and his life. He would reopen Emma's case, not as the guilt-ridden officer who had failed her, but as the investigator who finally understood that her disappearance was part of something larger and more dangerous than anyone had realized. Guardian seemed to sense the change in Daniel's resolve. The dog rose from his position on the floor and placed his head in Daniel's lap, his brown eyes reflecting a trust and understanding that transcended the normal bond between human and animal. "We're going to find out what happened to her," Daniel promised, his voice steady with newfound purpose, "and we're going to make sure whoever took her finally pays for what they did." Outside the station windows, Cedar Falls settled into its evening routine, unaware that the mystery that had haunted their community for 15 years was about to be reopened by the very officer who had been blamed for its failure to solve. The past was calling, and Daniel Reyes was finally ready to answer. 3 days after the revelation in Martinez's office, Guardian led Daniel to a discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about Emma's disappearance. The dog had been restless since dawn, pacing through Daniel's house with the focused energy of an animal on a mission. Every attempt to settle him with food or attention was met with polite refusal and increasingly insistent behavior that suggested urgency. "What is it, boy?" Daniel asked as Guardian positioned himself by the front door for the 3rd time in an hour. "What do you want to show me?" Guardian's response was to look directly at Daniel, then at the door, then back at Daniel, with an expression that seemed to say the answer was obvious. This wasn't random restlessness. This was purposeful communication from an animal who had something important to share. Daniel clipped a leash to Guardian's collar, though he suspected it was unnecessary. The dog had shown no inclination to run away or wander, maintaining a protective proximity to Daniel that suggested their bond went beyond normal pet-owner relationships. As they stepped outside into the crisp October morning, Guardian immediately set off toward the rural roads that led away from Cedar Falls. The destination became clear after 20 minutes of steady walking. Guardian was leading them toward the original search area from Emma's disappearance, the wooded region near Riverside Park, where Daniel had focused so much of his attention 15 years ago. But instead of heading toward the park itself, Guardian turned onto an overgrown trail that led deeper into the woods than the original search teams had penetrated. "This is private property," Daniel said, as they passed a weathered "no trespassing" sign that hung from a rusted fence post. "We probably shouldn't." Guardian's urgent whine cut him off, and the dog's body language made it clear that legal niceties were less important than whatever lay ahead on the trail. Daniel had learned to trust Guardian's instincts, and something about the dog's determination suggested they were close to answers that had eluded investigators for 15 years. The trail wound through stands of oak and maple that formed a canopy. Overhead, filtering the morning light into dappled patterns that shifted with the breeze. This was old-growth forest, untouched by development and thick enough to hide secrets from casual observation. Daniel noted deer tracks in the soft earth, the scattered remains of campfires that spoke of occasional human presence, and the kind of natural debris that accumulated in places where few people ventured. Guardian's pace increased as they penetrated deeper into the woods, his nose working constantly to follow scents that Daniel couldn't detect. The dog moved with the confidence of someone retracing familiar steps, navigating around fallen logs and through thickets with an efficiency that suggested prior knowledge of the terrain. After nearly an hour of hiking, Guardian stopped beside what appeared to be the remnants of a small structure, perhaps a hunting cabin or storage shed that had been abandoned to the elements years ago. Only the foundation stones remained visible, along with scattered lumber that nature was slowly reclaiming. But Guardian's attention was focused on something else entirely. The dog began digging at a spot near the foundation, his powerful paws moving earth with the determination of an animal who knew exactly what he was looking for. Daniel watched in fascination as Guardian excavated what appeared to be a deliberately concealed cache, his movements precise and purposeful. "What did you bury here, boy?" Daniel asked, kneeling beside Guardian to help with the digging. The answer came in the form of a rusted metal box, approximately the size of a shoebox, and wrapped in what had once been a plastic garbage bag. The container was buried about 18 inches deep, positioned in a location that would have been protected from casual discovery, but accessible to someone who knew where to look. Daniel's hands trembled as he brushed soil from the metal surface, revealing what appeared to be an old ammunition box that had been repurposed as a storage container. The rust was superficial, and the seal seemed intact, suggesting that whatever was inside had been protected from moisture and deterioration. Guardian sat back on his haunches and watched as Daniel worked to open the corroded latches, his tail wagging slowly with what seemed like satisfaction at a job well done. The dog's behavior suggested this was what they'd come to find, a treasure he'd protected and preserved for reasons that were about to become clear. The lid opened with a metallic groan, revealing contents that made Daniel's breath catch in his throat. Inside were items that told the story of a young girl's final days. A small diary with a purple cover, several pieces of jewelry including a silver locket, and photographs that showed Emma Martinez in the company of an adult she clearly trusted. But it was the letter that lay on top of the other items that brought tears to Daniel's eyes. Written in a child's careful handwriting on lined notebook paper, the words carried a maturity and wisdom that spoke of extraordinary circumstances. "If someone finds this, my name is Emma Martinez, and I am 8 years old. A bad man took me from the park, but he's not as smart as he thinks he is. Max and I got away, but I am hurt and I don't think we can make it home. Max is the best dog in the world, and he has been taking care of me, but I am getting weaker, and I don't want him to get hurt trying to protect me. If you are reading this, please tell my family that I love them and that I was not scared at the end because Max was with me. Please tell Officer Reyes that it was not his fault. The bad man was too sneaky and nobody could have stopped him. I heard him talking on his phone about making sure nobody would look for me in the right places. Max knows who the bad man is. He saw everything and he remembers. Please take care of Max, and maybe he can help you catch the bad man so he doesn't hurt any other children. I buried my diary and my locket here so my family would know I was thinking about them. The pictures show the bad man. Max was very smart and knocked them out of his pocket when we escaped. I hope they help you. Tell everyone I tried to be brave. Love, Emma." Daniel read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new depths of courage and wisdom from a child who had faced unimaginable terror with remarkable composure. Emma hadn't simply vanished. She had escaped her abductor, survived in the wilderness for days or weeks with Guardian's help, and had the presence of mind to preserve evidence that could identify her attacker. The photographs that Emma had mentioned were wrapped in plastic at the bottom of the box, protected from moisture but clear enough to show their contents. The images were candid shots of a man in an expensive suit, apparently taken without his knowledge. The quality was poor. They appeared to have been taken with a disposable camera from some distance, but the subject was clearly visible. Daniel's blood ran cold as he recognized the face in the photographs. Thomas Kellerman, Cedar Falls' most respected real estate developer and a man who had served on the city council for over a decade. Kellerman owned significant property throughout the county, including the land where they now sat. He was also the kind of man whose word carried weight in community affairs, whose reputation for charity and civic involvement had made him virtually above suspicion. Guardian moved closer to Daniel, pressing against his side as if sensing the emotional impact of the discovery. The dog's brown eyes held an expression that seemed to convey both grief for his lost companion and satisfaction that her story was finally being told. The diary revealed the full horror of Emma's ordeal. In entries written over the course of nearly 2 weeks, she documented her abduction from the park, her imprisonment in what appeared to be a basement, and her eventual escape with Guardian's help. Kellerman had taken her to show clients who were interested in special arrangements, but Emma had been too young to fully understand the implications of what she was describing. The final entries in the diary grew shorter and less coherent as Emma's condition deteriorated. She wrote of Guardian bringing her water from the creek, of sharing whatever food the dog could scavenge, and of the growing weakness that made it difficult for her to write. Her last entry was dated nearly 3 weeks after her disappearance. "Max won't leave me, even though I told him to go home. He is the best friend anyone could have. I hope someone finds this someday and knows that we tried our best." As Daniel closed the diary and carefully repacked the evidence, Guardian rose and walked to another spot near the foundation stones. The dog began a different kind of digging, more gentle and reverent than his earlier excavation. Within minutes, he had uncovered what Daniel realized was Emma's final resting place, a small grave that Guardian had dug and maintained for 15 years. The discovery of Emma's remains would require careful documentation and forensic examination, but Daniel understood now that she had died from exposure and exhaustion rather than direct violence. She had outlasted her abductor's expectations, escaped his control, and preserved evidence that would finally bring him to justice. Guardian had spent 15 years protecting Emma's memory and her evidence, surviving in the wilderness while waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth. His appearance in Daniel's life wasn't coincidence. It was the fulfillment of a promise made by a dying child to a faithful companion. As afternoon shadows lengthened through the forest canopy, Daniel radioed for backup and the county coroner, knowing that the next few hours would bring closure to a case that had haunted Cedar Falls for 15 years. But he also understood that their work was far from finished. Thomas Kellerman was still free, still in a position of authority and trust, and still dangerous to any child who caught his attention. Guardian had brought him the evidence needed to seek justice for Emma, but the final confrontation with her killer would test everything Daniel had learned about courage, redemption, and the price of protecting the innocent. The past had finally revealed its secrets, and now it was time for the present to act on them. The forensic examination of Emma's remains and the evidence Guardian had protected confirmed what Daniel already knew in his heart. Thomas Kellerman had murdered an 8-year-old girl and spent 15 years living freely in the community she'd called home. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, serving as acting county coroner, determined that Emma had died approximately 3 weeks after her disappearance, succumbing to exposure and dehydration while hiding in the wilderness with her devoted companion. The photographs Emma had preserved were analyzed by state crime lab technicians who enhanced the images and confirmed Kellerman's identity beyond any reasonable doubt. The diary entries provided a timeline and description of Emma's ordeal that painted Kellerman not just as a killer, but as someone involved in activities that suggested other victims and a network of associates willing to pay for access to children. Sheriff Martinez had convened an emergency meeting in the police station's conference room, where Daniel sat surrounded by federal agents, state investigators, and local law enforcement officials who'd been called in once the full scope of Kellerman's crimes became apparent. Guardian lay at Daniel's feet, somehow understanding that his long vigil was nearing its end and that justice for Emma was finally within reach. Special Agent Rebecca Torres of the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit spread Emma's photographs across the conference table, her expression grim with the controlled anger of someone who dedicated her career to protecting the innocent. These images suggest that Kellerman wasn't working alone. The quality and positioning indicate they were taken by someone who understood the value of documentation. Emma wrote that she knocked them from his pocket during their escape. Daniel explained. his voice steady despite the emotional weight of discussing the child's final ordeal. She was remarkably brave and resourceful. She was also lucky, Agent Torres replied. Most children in her situation don't survive long enough to gather evidence or escape their captors. The fact that she did, with this dog's help, gives us an opportunity to shut down what appears to be a significant criminal enterprise. State Detective Mike Kowalski, Ray's older brother and a specialist in organized crime, leaned forward to study the enhanced photographs. The basement where Emma was held, do we have any idea of the location? Daniel consulted Emma's diary, reading carefully from the passages where she described her imprisonment. She mentions hearing trains in the distance, and she could smell something that reminded her of her grandmother's garden, specifically roses and honeysuckle. There was also the sound of machinery running intermittently, possibly farm equipment. Sheriff Martinez spread a county map across the table and began marking locations that matched Emma's descriptions. Kellerman owns property in 3 different areas that have rail access and agricultural operations nearby. His main residence on Maple Hill, the development tract near the interstate, and the old Pemberton farm, where his company is planning a subdivision. The Pemberton place, Daniel said with sudden recognition. That's where the new family moved in, the Garcias. Sarah mentioned it on the morning of my attack. Agent Torres made a note on her legal pad. We'll need to evacuate any civilians from the area before we move on Kellerman. If he's still using that property for criminal activities, the presence of innocent families could complicate tactical operations. The investigation had moved beyond local jurisdiction, but Daniel found himself at the center of the federal task force due to his intimate knowledge of the case and his unique partnership with Guardian. The dog had become an unofficial member of the law enforcement team, his reactions and behavior providing insights that human investigators couldn't access through conventional means. Dr. Lisa Warren entered the conference room carrying a folder that contained her analysis of Guardian's behavior over the past week. As the veterinarian who'd first discovered Emma's drawing in the dog's collar, she'd become an integral part of understanding the connection between past and present. I've been observing Guardian's responses to various stimuli, Dr. Warren reported, including photographs of potential suspects, audio recordings, and scent samples. His reactions are consistent and specific. He shows clear recognition of Kellerman's image and voice, along with signs of stress and protective behavior. Can that kind of evidence be used in court? Asked Detective Kowalski. Not directly, Agent Torres replied, but Guardian's reactions can guide our investigation and help us focus on the most promising leads. Animal behavior evidence has been accepted in some jurisdictions as corroborating testimony. As the briefing continued, Daniel studied satellite imagery of Kellerman's properties, looking for tactical advantages and potential escape routes. The old Pemberton farm was isolated, surrounded by agricultural land that provided both concealment and fields of fire that could work for or against law enforcement, depending on how the operation was planned. Kellerman's been careful for 15 years, Martinez observed. He's not going to come quietly, and he's probably got contingency plans for if his activities were ever discovered. Agent Torres nodded in agreement. Our intelligence suggests he's part of a larger network that operates across state lines. Taking him down will require coordination with multiple agencies and careful attention to preserving evidence that could lead to other arrests. The tactical planning session stretched into the evening, with federal agents working with local law enforcement to develop an approach that would minimize risk to civilians while maximizing the chances of capturing Kellerman alive. The businessman's position in the community meant that any operation would generate significant media attention and public scrutiny. Guardian seemed to sense the building tension in the room, his posture becoming more alert as the discussion focused on the coming confrontation with Kellerman. The dog's brown eyes moved between the photographs and maps, with an intelligence that suggested he understood they were planning to face the man who had killed his beloved Emma. "There's something else we need to consider," Daniel said as the tactical briefing concluded. "My attack 3 days ago. Someone wanted me dead before I could make the connection to Emma's case. That suggests Kellerman has associates who are willing to commit murder to protect him." Agent Torres made another note. "We'll coordinate with State Police to monitor known associates and business partners. If Kellerman tries to run or call for help, we need to be ready to intercept communications and block escape routes." Detective Kowalski pulled out his phone to check the latest surveillance reports. "Our undercover units have been watching Kellerman's movements since this morning. He's maintaining his normal routine, attended a city council meeting, had lunch at the country club, returned to his office around 2 o'clock. But his security detail has increased, and he's made several encrypted phone calls. He knows something's wrong," Daniel concluded. "The question is whether he knows how much we've discovered." Sheriff Martinez stood and walked to the window overlooking Main Street, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. "Thomas Kellerman has been a pillar of this community for 20 years. When we move against him, it's going to shake people's faith in everything they thought they knew about their neighbors." "Sometimes that's necessary," Agent Torres replied. "Communities can't heal from crimes like these until the truth comes out, no matter how painful that truth might be." As the federal agents finalized their operational plans, Daniel found himself thinking about Emma's letter and her remarkable forgiveness of his perceived failures. The 8-year-old girl had understood something about justice and redemption that had taken him 15 years to learn, that blame was less important than action, and that the past could only be redeemed through courage in the present. Guardian rose from his position on the floor and padded over to Daniel, resting his massive head against the officer's knee. The gesture was both comforting and purposeful, as if the dog understood that their long journey together was approaching its climax and wanted to offer reassurance before the final confrontation. "What's the timeline for the operation?" Daniel asked Agent Torres. "We move tomorrow at dawn. Kellerman's morning routine takes him to his office by 7:30, which gives us a window to secure the Pemberton property and evacuate the Garcia family before he realizes what's happening." Torres consulted her notes. "Local units will handle the evacuation while federal teams position around Kellerman's office and residence. We want him to feel the net tightening gradually so he doesn't panic and run." Dr. Warren gathered her files and prepared to leave, but paused at the conference room door. "Guardian's going with you tomorrow, isn't he?" Daniel looked down at the golden retriever, whose brown eyes reflected a mixture of determination and peace. "He's been waiting 15 years for this moment. I think he's earned the right to see it through. Just remember that he's not just a police dog. He's a survivor who watched his best friend die because of what Kellerman did. His emotional investment in this case is deeper than any human partner could understand." As the federal agents departed to finalize their preparations and local officers returned to their regular duties, Daniel and Guardian found themselves alone in the conference room with Sheriff Martinez. The three of them, man, dog, and mentor, represented the convergence of past failure and present opportunity that would define the next 24 hours. "You ready for this, Danny?" Martinez asked, his voice carrying the weight of 4 decades in law enforcement. "I've been ready for 15 years, Daniel replied. "I just didn't know it until Guardian showed me what I'd been missing." Martinez smiled and placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "Emma chose her friend well. That dog knew exactly who to save and when to save him." As they prepared to leave the station, Guardian stopped at the conference room window and looked out at the quiet streets of Cedar Falls. The dog's posture was alert but calm, as if he were taking one last look at the community that would soon learn the truth about the man they'd trusted and respected. Daniel joined Guardian at the window, following the dog's gaze across the main street that had been the center of his professional life for 20 years. Tomorrow, Everything would change. Thomas Kellerman would be exposed as a predator and murderer. Families would question their assumptions about safety and trust, and the long shadow of Emma Martinez's disappearance would finally be lifted from the community. "Tomorrow we finish what Emma started," Daniel said to Guardian, his voice steady with resolve. "Tomorrow we bring her home." Guardian's tail wagged once, slowly, as if acknowledging both the promise and the responsibility that came. With it, the golden retriever who had saved Daniel's life was about to help him save his soul, and in doing so would finally complete the mission that an 8-year-old girl had entrusted to him 15 years ago. The past was calling for justice, and Daniel Reyes was finally ready to answer that call with the courage and wisdom that Emma's sacrifice had taught him. Guardian had shown him the way forward, but the final steps of their journey would require everything both man and dog had learned about loyalty, sacrifice, and the price of protecting the innocent. As night settled over Cedar Falls, Daniel and Guardian returned home to prepare for what might be the most important day of their lives. The evidence was gathered, the plans were made, and the truth was ready to emerge from 15 years of darkness. All that remained was the courage to see it through to the end. Dawn broke grey and cold over Cedar Falls as federal agents and local law enforcement officers moved into position around Thomas Kellerman's properties. Daniel sat in his patrol car. At the edge of the Pemberton farm, Guardian alert and focused in the passenger seat, both of them watching as FBI tactical teams established a perimeter around the property where Emma Martinez had spent her final days. The evacuation of the Garcia family had proceeded smoothly, with agents posing as utility workers to conduct what they claimed was an emergency gas line inspection. Maria Garcia had been confused but cooperative, gathering her 2 young children and following the workers to safety without realizing she was being removed from potential danger. Agent Torres's voice crackled through Daniel's radio. "All units, target is confirmed at his office location. Local teams have eyes on the Pemberton property. No signs of current occupancy in the basement area, but we're proceeding with full tactical precautions." Daniel adjusted his vest and checked his service weapon, muscle memory from 20 years of police work, combining with the heightened awareness that came from knowing this operation would define the rest of his career. Guardian sensed the tension, his ears pricked forward and his body coiled with the alertness of an animal preparing for action. The Pemberton farmhouse stood empty in the morning light, its windows dark and its yard overgrown with weeds that spoke of abandonment and neglect. But Daniel knew that beneath this innocent facade lay the basement where Emma had been held, and possibly evidence of other crimes that Kellerman had committed over the years. "Unit 7, you're cleared to approach the main structure," Agent Torres radioed. "Guardian team will provide backup while we conduct the initial sweep." Daniel and Guardian approached the farmhouse with measured steps, both of them alert for any signs of danger or recent activity. The front door was secured with a heavy padlock that looked newer than the rest of the structure, and the windows were covered with boards that had been carefully installed to prevent observation from outside. Guardian's behavior became more focused as they drew closer to the house, his nose working constantly to process scents that Daniel couldn't detect. The dog's body language suggested recognition rather than discovery. This was a place he'd been before, probably during his weeks in the wilderness with Emma. The FBI tactical team reached the house moments after Daniel and Guardian, their movements precise and professional as they prepared to breach the structure. Agent Torres positioned herself near the front door, while other agents moved to cover potential escape routes and secondary entrances. "Breaching now," Torres announced over the radio. The front door splintered under the impact of the tactical team's battering ram, and agents flowed into the house with weapons drawn and flashlights cutting through the darkness. Daniel and Guardian followed, their role as witnesses and investigators beginning as the tactical phase concluded. The interior of the farmhouse told the story of a structure that had been abandoned by its original owners, but maintained for specific purposes by someone who needed privacy and isolation. The main floor showed signs of recent use: folding chairs arranged in a circle, a table covered with papers and photographs, and electronic equipment that suggested surveillance or communication capabilities. But it was the basement that revealed the full horror of what Kellerman had done. The space had been converted into a prison, with steel doors, reinforced walls, and multiple rooms that could house victims while maintaining complete soundproofing from the outside world. Emma's prison had been just one part of a larger operation. Guardian descended the basement stairs with Daniel, his movements careful but determined. The dog's behavior suggested he was retracing steps he'd taken 15 years ago, when he'd helped Emma escape from this nightmare and flee into the wilderness. One of the basement rooms contained evidence that made Agent Torres call for additional forensic specialists: photographs, videos, and documents that detailed a network of predators who had used Kellerman's facilities to abuse children from across the region. The scope of the criminal enterprise was far larger than anyone had imagined. "Daniel," Agent Torres called from across the basement, "Guardians found something." The dog was standing beside what appeared to be a utility closet, his attention focused on a section of wall that looked different from the surrounding structure. When agents opened the space, they discovered a hidden exit, a tunnel that led from the basement to a concealed opening near the tree line, providing an escape route that explained how Emma and Guardian had managed to flee without being immediately recaptured. "This is how they got out," Daniel said, examining the narrow passage that would have been barely large enough for a child and a dog. Emma was small enough to fit, and Guardian would have followed her anywhere. The tunnel also explained how Kellerman had initially evaded detection. If authorities had ever gotten close to discovering his activities, he could have moved victims through the underground passage to vehicles waiting in the woods. Emma's escape had probably used his own exit strategy against him. As federal agents continued documenting evidence throughout the farmhouse, Daniel's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from the surveillance team watching Kellerman's office. "Target is mobile. Repeat, target is mobile." Black sedan heading east on Highway 9 appears to be moving toward the Pemberton property. Agent Torres immediately began coordinating the response. "All units, Kellerman is en route to our location. Establish roadblocks at County Roads 15 and 23. Do not allow him to reach this property." But even as law enforcement scrambled to intercept Kellerman, Daniel realized that the businessman was probably following a predetermined escape plan. Someone had warned him that the net was closing, and he was moving to retrieve evidence or resources that would help him flee the country. Guardian's behavior suddenly changed, his alertness shifting to active alarm as his ears picked up sounds that preceded the arrival of vehicles. The dog moved to Daniel's side and pressed against his leg, a gesture of protection that suggested imminent danger. "He's coming," Daniel said into his radio. Guardian can hear him approaching. The sound of a powerful engine became audible to human ears, followed by the crunch of gravel as a vehicle turned into the Pemberton property despite the law enforcement presence. Thomas Kellerman was driving directly into the trap, either out of desperation or confidence that he could still control the situation. Agent Torres positioned her team to intercept Kellerman while maintaining tactical advantage. But Daniel understood that the businessman wouldn't surrender quietly. A man who had built his life on controlling others and escaping consequences wouldn't accept defeat without a fight. As Kellerman's black sedan approached the farmhouse, Guardian's protective instincts intensified. The dog had waited 15 years for this confrontation, and his body language suggested that he was prepared to finish what had started when Emma died in his arms in the wilderness. The final confrontation between past and present was about to begin, and Daniel knew that everything he'd learned about courage, justice, and redemption would be tested in the next few minutes. Emma Martinez was about to receive the justice she died trying to preserve, and Guardian was about to complete the mission his young companion had entrusted to him. Thomas Kellerman emerged from his sedan with the calm arrogance of a man who believed his wealth and position still afforded him protection from consequences. At 63, he remained imposing, tall, silver-haired, and dressed in the kind of expensive suit that had helped him maintain his facade of respectability for 15 years. But his eyes held the cold calculation of a predator who had been cornered and was prepared to fight. "This is a mistake," Kellerman announced as FBI agents positioned themselves around him, their weapons drawn but not yet aimed. "I'm a member of the City Council, and I demand to know why federal agents are trespassing on my property." Agent Torres stepped forward, her badge clearly visible and her voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced down predators before. "Thomas Kellerman, you're under arrest for the kidnapping and murder of Emma Martinez, along with federal charges related to child trafficking and racketeering." Daniel watched from his position near the farmhouse as Kellerman's expression shifted from arrogance to recognition to something approaching panic. The businessman's gaze swept across the assembled law enforcement officers before settling on Daniel and Guardian with unmistakable hatred. "Officer Reyes," Kellerman said, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and contempt, "I should have known you'd be involved in this farce, still trying to solve cases that are beyond your capabilities." The taunt was designed to provoke, but Daniel felt only the steady calm that came from finally understanding his role in Emma's story. "We found her, Kellerman. We found Emma, and we found the evidence she preserved to make sure you'd pay for what you did." Kellerman's composure cracked slightly at the mention of Emma, his eyes darting toward the farmhouse as if calculating whether his secrets were still safe. "I don't know what you think you've found, but we found her diary," Daniel continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke the truth that had been hidden for 15 years. "We found the photographs she took of you. We found her grave, where Guardian has been protecting her memory since the day she died." At the mention of Guardian's name, Kellerman's attention shifted to the golden retriever with a recognition that confirmed everything Daniel had suspected. This wasn't the first time Kellerman had seen the dog. Guardian represented a living witness to crimes that the businessman had thought were buried with his victim. "That animal should have died with her," Kellerman said, his mask of respectability finally slipping to reveal the monster beneath. Guardian's response was immediate and decisive. The dog moved with fluid grace, positioning himself between Daniel and Kellerman while emitting a low growl that spoke of 15 years of patient waiting and accumulated grief. This was the confrontation Guardian had been preparing for since Emma's death. Kellerman's hand moved toward his jacket, a motion that triggered immediate reaction from the federal agents. "Weapon!" Agent Torres shouted, and suddenly the quiet morning erupted into motion and shouted commands. But instead of a gun, Kellerman withdrew a hunting knife, the same type of blade that Emma had described in her diary, the weapon he'd used to threaten her during her captivity. The choice of weapon wasn't random. It was personal, a deliberate echo of the trauma he'd inflicted on a helpless child. "You want to know what happened to your precious Emma?" Kellerman snarled, brandishing the knife as agents sought clear shots that wouldn't endanger civilians. "She was supposed to be special merchandise, worth a lot of money to my clients, but she was too smart, too resourceful. She cost me everything." Daniel felt Guardian's muscles tense beside him as the dog prepared to act. The golden retriever had protected Emma as best he could, had helped her escape and survive longer than anyone thought possible, and had carried the burden of her death for 15 years. Now faced with her killer, Guardian's protective instincts focused with laser intensity. "She died slowly in those woods," Kellerman continued, his voice filled with a cruelty that made Agent Torres's finger tighten on her weapon's trigger. "Calling for her mother, calling for help that never came. And that stupid dog stayed with her until the end, too loyal to leave even when she was obviously dying." The words were designed to inflict maximum psychological damage, But they had the opposite effect on Daniel. Instead of breaking him down, they filled him with a calm certainty about what needed to happen next. Emma Martinez had been braver at 8 years old than most adults would ever be, and her courage deserved to be honored with action, not paralyzed by emotion. "Emma forgave me for failing her," Daniel said, his voice carrying across the farmyard with quiet strength. "She wrote it in her letter, but I don't think she'd forgive what you just said about her death." Kellerman lunged forward with the hunting knife, aiming for Daniel with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. But Guardian was already in motion, 15 years of patient protection, finally unleashed in a golden blur of loyalty and determination. The collision between dog and man sent Kellerman sprawling backward, the knife flying from his grip to clatter harmlessly across the gravel. Guardian pinned Kellerman to the ground with the full weight of his body, not attacking but restraining, holding the killer in place while federal agents moved to secure the scene. "Guardian, hold!" Daniel commanded, and the dog responded with the precision of a trained law enforcement animal, maintaining pressure on Kellerman while allowing agents to apply restraints. As handcuffs clicked into place around Kellerman's wrists, Agent Torres read him his rights with the satisfaction of someone who had dedicated her career to protecting children from predators. The businessman's arrogance had finally been stripped away, revealing him as just another criminal who had traded children's lives for his own gratification. But Guardian's work wasn't finished. As agents helped Kellerman to his feet, the golden retriever suffered what appeared to be a seizure, his powerful body convulsing as he collapsed to the gravel. Daniel immediately knelt beside his partner, recognizing the signs of a heart attack, brought on by the stress and exertion of the confrontation. "Get Dr. Warren on the radio," Daniel shouted, cradling Guardian's head as the dog's breathing became labored and irregular. "We need a veterinarian here now." Guardian's brown eyes found Daniel's face, and in them Daniel saw not pain but peace, the satisfaction of a mission finally completed and a promise finally kept. The dog had survived 15 years in the wilderness, had found Daniel when he needed saving, and had helped bring Emma's killer to justice. Now, with Kellerman in custody, Guardian could finally rest. Dr. Warren arrived within minutes, her emergency medical kit already prepared for what she knew might be Guardian's final moments. As she worked to stabilize the dog's condition, Daniel held Guardian's head and whispered the words that needed to be said. "You did it, boy. You brought her justice. Emma would be so proud of you." Guardian's tail wagged once, weakly, and his breathing seemed to ease, as if Daniel's words had provided the reassurance he needed. The golden retriever, who had saved Daniel's life, was teaching him one final lesson about loyalty, sacrifice, and the price of protecting the innocent. As paramedics arrived to transport Guardian to the veterinary hospital, Daniel looked back at the farmhouse where Emma had been held and died, then at the patrol car where Thomas Kellerman sat in federal custody. The past had finally been reconciled with the present, and justice had been served by the courage of an 8-year-old girl and the loyalty of her remarkable companion. Guardian had completed his mission, but Daniel's was just beginning. Emma's story would need to be told, her courage celebrated, and her killer held accountable for 15 years of hidden crimes. The golden retriever had shown him the way forward, and now it was time to honor that gift by ensuring that Emma Martinez's sacrifice would protect other children from similar fates. 1 year later, Daniel Reyes stood before a memorial plaque that gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, its bronze surface reflecting the golden leaves of the oak trees that surrounded Emma Martinez's final resting place. The memorial had been installed in Riverside Park, not far from where Emma had played on the day she was taken, but in a spot that captured the essence of her courage and the loyalty of the remarkable dog who had protected her memory. The inscription read, "Emma Martinez, beloved daughter, brave heart, forever 8, and Max, faithful guardian, loyal friend, protector of the innocent." Below the words, 2 bronze paw prints were embedded in the stone, one small and human, one larger and canine, joined together for eternity. Guardian had survived his heart attack, though Dr. Warren had warned that his advanced age and the stress of his long vigil had taken their toll. The Golden Retriever now lived with Daniel as his official partner in a new program that provided therapy dogs for law enforcement officers dealing with trauma and PTSD. Guardian's gentle presence and intuitive understanding of human pain had already helped 3 officers work through difficult cases and personal struggles. The dog rested beside Daniel now, his graying muzzle peaceful as he watched children play on the same playground equipment where Emma had spent her last moments of freedom. Guardian no longer carried the restless energy of an animal with an unfinished mission. His purpose had been fulfilled, and he could finally live in the present rather than being haunted by the past. Sheriff Martinez approached the memorial with the careful steps of a man whose joints reminded him daily of his 73 years, but whose mind remained sharp enough to appreciate the full scope of what Guardian and Daniel had accomplished. The sheriff carried a folder containing updates on the federal investigation that had grown out of Emma's case. Kellerman was sentenced this morning, Martinez reported, settling onto the bench that had been placed near the memorial. Life without parole, plus consecutive terms for the federal charges. The judge said it was one of the most heinous cases she'd ever seen. Daniel nodded, feeling neither satisfaction nor vindication, but simply a quiet sense that justice had been served. What about his associates? 17 arrests across 6 states, with more pending as the investigation continues. Emma's evidence broke open a network that had been operating for over 20 years. Martinez's voice carried the weight of a career spent protecting the innocent. That little girl saved more children than we'll ever know. The federal investigation had revealed the full scope of Kellerman's criminal enterprise, a sophisticated network that had trafficked children across state lines, using properties in rural areas to avoid detection while serving wealthy clients, who paid premium prices for access to vulnerable victims. Emma's photographs and diary entries had provided the crucial evidence needed to dismantle the entire operation. Guardian lifted his head as a group of children ran past, their laughter echoing across the park in a sound that had been missing from this place for too long. The dog's tail wagged slowly as he watched them play, his protective instincts still intact but no longer driven by the urgency of unsolved crimes and unavenged deaths. "How's the new officer working out?" Martinez asked, referring to the recent addition to the Cedar Falls police force. "Sarah Chen Jr. is going to be excellent," Daniel replied, with genuine enthusiasm. "She has her mother's attention to detail and her father's instincts for reading people. Plus, she specifically requested assignment to cases involving missing children." The hiring of Sarah's daughter had been part of a broader change in how Cedar Falls approached child safety and criminal investigation. Daniel had used his experience with Emma's case to develop new protocols for missing person investigations, emphasizing the importance of considering abduction scenarios from the beginning, rather than assuming children had simply wandered off. Dr. Warren approached the memorial carrying a small wreath of wildflowers that she placed near the bronze paw prints. The veterinarian had become an integral part of the therapy dog program, using her understanding of animal behavior to match officers with companions who could help them process trauma and stress. Guardian's latest checkup shows his heart is stable, Dr. Warren reported, kneeling to scratch the dog's ears. "He's not a young dog anymore, but he's found peace. That makes all the difference in the world for his overall health." As afternoon, shadows lengthened across Riverside Park, other members of the community began arriving for the weekly gathering that had grown organically around Emma's memorial. Parents brought their children to play, while adults shared stories and maintained the sense of watchfulness that had developed since Kellerman's arrest and conviction. Maria Garcia approached with her 2 young children, the family that had been unknowingly living near the site of Emma's imprisonment. The Garcias had become advocates for child safety, working with Daniel to educate other families about the warning signs of predatory behavior and the importance of trusting instincts about potentially dangerous situations. "Officer Daniel," called 8-year-old Isabella Garcia, running ahead of her mother to greet Guardian with the fearless affection that only children possessed. "Can Guardian come to our school program next week?" Daniel smiled, watching as Guardian accepted Isabella's attention with the patient gentleness that had made him perfect for therapy work. "I think Guardian would like that very much. He enjoys meeting children and helping them understand that some dogs are specially trained to help people." The therapy dog program had expanded beyond law enforcement to include work with children who had experienced trauma or were struggling with anxiety and depression. Guardian's remarkable story had inspired donations and volunteer support that allowed the program to serve families throughout the county. As the informal gathering continued, Daniel found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 15 years ago, he had been a young officer whose overconfidence had contributed to a delayed investigation. 3 years ago, he had been a guilt-ridden veteran contemplating retirement and questioning his worth as a protector of the innocent. Today, he was a man who understood that redemption came not from erasing past mistakes, but from using those experiences to serve others more effectively. Emma's forgiveness, preserved in her final letter, had freed him from the paralysis of guilt and allowed him to channel his experience into positive action. Guardian rose from his position beside the bench and walked to the memorial plaque, placing his paw on the bronze surface in a gesture that had become his ritual whenever they visited Emma's resting place. The dog would sit quietly for several minutes, as if communicating with the spirit of the little girl who had trusted him with her life and her legacy. Sheriff Martinez stood to leave, his evening rounds calling him back to the duties that would continue until his retirement later that year. "Emma would be 19 now," he observed, his voice carrying the wistfulness of a man who had learned to measure time in terms of the children he'd protected and the ones he'd lost. "She would have been extraordinary," Daniel replied, certainty in his voice. "She already was extraordinary. Her courage saved more lives than we'll ever be able to count." As darkness settled over Cedar Falls and families began gathering their children for the journey home, Daniel and Guardian remained beside the memorial. This had become their evening routine, a quiet time of reflection and remembrance that honored Emma's memory while acknowledging the peace that her justice had brought to the community. Guardian settled beside Daniel on the bench, his graying head resting against the officer's leg in a gesture of contentment and trust. The bond between them had been forged in darkness and desperation, but it had evolved into something deeper, a partnership based on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the understanding that some connections transcend the normal boundaries between human and animal. The golden retriever who had saved Daniel's life had also saved his soul, teaching him that courage could emerge from the deepest pain and that justice was worth any sacrifice required to achieve it. Emma Martinez had died too young, but her legacy lived on in the work they did together and in the children who played safely in parks where predators no longer found easy prey. As stars appeared in the darkening sky above Cedar Falls, Daniel made the same promise he offered every evening at Emma's memorial. "We'll keep watching, sweetheart. Guardian and I will make sure other children stay safe." Guardian's tail thumped once against the bench, a gentle acknowledgement of the covenant they had made with a brave little girl whose spirit would guide their work for whatever years remained to them. The past had been reconciled with the present, justice had been served, and the future held the promise of continued protection for the innocent, a legacy worthy of Emma Martinez and the remarkable dog who had refused to let her story end in darkness.